Time had a different meaning in the heart of the ancient forest. It was measured not in the passing of seasons, but in the slow, inexorable creep of moss over granite and the gradual silencing of the old gods. Here, in a grove untouched by axe or plow, lived Kalen. He was the last of his kind, a druid whose life was woven into the very roots of the gnarled oaks and the deep, dark veins of the earth. Once, he had been a guardian, a tender of balance. But centuries of solitude are a crucible for the soul, and his had cooled into something hard, sharp, and cruel. His home was a barrow of tangled roots and stone, a place where the air hummed with a power that had long since faded from the world. He moved through the shadows not as a man, but as a presence, a sudden chill, a whisper of movement where none should be. The creatures of the wood, from the lowliest vole to the great antlered stags he protected, knew his scent and his law. The forest was his sanctuary, his kingdom, and his prison. He remembered a student, a bright-faced youth with a laugh that echoed like a stream, whose life had been extinguished by a fever his magic could not cure. That loss was the first crack, and the long empty years that followed had widened it into a chasm. Now the memory was a phantom limb, a source not of grief, but of a simmering, directionless wrath. Any intrusion was a personal affront, a spark to the tinder of his resentment. He was no longer a guardian, he was a warden, and his only remaining duty was to punish. The silence was the first thing to die. It was shattered by the crude crash of snapping branches and the rough, echoing laughter of men. 3 hunters, their faces flushed with ale and arrogance, pushed their way into the sacred grove where the oldest oaks stood sentinel. They were outsiders, their scents an ugly stain of wood smoke, sweat, and cold iron. In their hands, they carried sharp-tipped spears, instruments of death that gleamed with a profane light in the green-tinged gloom. Their leader, a broad-shouldered brute named Gareth, scanned the shadows with a hunter's gaze. But he was blind to the true life of the place. He saw only tracks and potential trophies, his mind already picturing the antlers of the great stag they pursued mounted on his wall. He could not feel the ancient power that vibrated through the soil beneath his boots, nor see the way the very leaves seemed to recoil from his touch. High in the tangled branches of a yew tree that had witnessed empires rise and fall, Kalen watched. His ancient eyes, cold and hard as river stones, followed their every clumsy movement. The air around him grew thick and cold. This was not merely trespass, it was a desecration. Sanctum, his only haven in a world that had forgotten him, had been violated. The simmering wrath that had become his constant companion now boiled over into a cold, murderous intent. The warden had pronounced his judgment, and the sentence was death. The forest, which had been still and waiting, now seemed to draw a sharp, predatory breath. A silent command, felt not heard, pulsed out from the heart of the grove. The forest, which had moments before been a place of watchful stillness, now became an extension of the druid's will. The hunters, emboldened by their initial foray, decided to split up, a fatal mistake born of overconfidence. Gareth, the leader, strayed from the path, his eyes fixed on a false trail. He never saw the shadow that detached itself from the thicket. It was a wild boar, but unlike any he had ever imagined, a mountain of scarred muscle and matted fur, with tusks like polished daggers. It did not charge with a warning squeal. It erupted from the foliage in a blur of rage. The first tisk ripped into his thigh, opening a seam of flesh from hip to knee. His scream was a high, thin thing, swallowed by the dense woods. The second thrust caught him in the gut, lifting him from his feet before tossing him aside like a broken doll. His final sight was of the beast standing over him, its hot, foul breath misting in the air as his life pooled on the roots of the ancient trees. Aelin, the second hunter, heard the choked-off cry and ran toward it, his spear held tight. Panic had already begun to frost the edges of his mind. He scrambled up a rocky outcrop, seeking a vantage point, and found only a different kind of death. A great wolf, its fur the color of granite and its eyes burning with a cold, sentient fire, was waiting, moved with impossible silence. As Aelin turned, the wolf was already in the air. Its jaws, powerful enough to snap the spine of a stag, closed over his throat with a wet, decisive crunch. The sound of tearing cartilage and the gush of blood were the only eulogy he received. His body tumbled down the rocks, coming to rest in a heap, his unseeing eyes staring up at a canopy that offered no mercy. In the sudden, profound silence that followed, the last hunter, a young man named Liam, stood alone. The triumphant arrogance of the hunt was gone, replaced by a primal, gut-wrenching terror. The forest was no longer a place of game. It was a cage, and he was the prey. The scent of fresh blood and voided bowels hung heavy in the air, a copper-thick perfume of death. He clutched his spear, its iron point trembling as he spun in a slow, desperate circle, watching the shadows themselves seem to writhe and advance. The hunt was over. The real hunt had just begun. Liam's world had shrunk to the frantic rhythm of his own heart and the oppressive silence that had swallowed the forest. The guttural sounds of his companions' deaths still echoed in his mind, more felt than heard. The iron scent of Garrett's butchery and the coppery temps of Elaine's spilled life filled his nostrils, a suffocating perfume. He was alone. His spear, once a symbol of prowess, felt like a child's toy in his trembling hands. He backed into a small clearing, his boots slipping on a patch of damp moss. His eyes darted from the impenetrable wall of ferns to the skeletal branches of the trees, expecting death to spring from every shadow. A low growl rumbled from the left, and he spun, spear leveled at empty air. From the right came the sound of a heavy body moving through undergrowth, and he whirled again, his breath catching in his throat. He was not being hunted by a single beast. The forest itself had become the predator. Then, the shadows at the edge of the clearing deepened, coalescing into a solid, terrifying form. It was a bear, but of a size and bearing that belonged to legend. Its fur was the dark, grizzled gray of ancient stone, and its eyes held not the simple hunger of an animal, but a cold, ancient intelligence. This was no chance encounter. This was a judgment, purposefully delivered. The beast did not charge. It simply emerged, its massive head low, its gaze pinning Liam where he stood. The young hunter's courage, already frayed to a thread, snapped. A pathetic whimper escaped his lips as the overwhelming presence of the creature washed over him. This was the architect of the slaughter. This was the warden of the wood. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his very soul, that any movement, any attack, would be his last. His fate was no longer in his hands. His spear fell from his numb fingers, its clatter on the forest floor a sound of absolute surrender. He was the last one standing, but he stood on the precipice of a death he could not comprehend, awaiting the whim of a force of nature made flesh. The great bear stood motionless, its hot breath pluming in the cool air, a living monolith of fur and muscle. Liam braced for the impact, for the crush of bone and the searing final pain. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the end. But the blow never came. A low, rumbling sound vibrated through the clearing, not a growl of aggression, but a contemplative hum. Kalen, the druid within the beast, looked upon the young man's face, pale and streaked with dirt and the sweat of terror. He saw the fine line of the jaw, clenched in a futile show of courage, and the shape of the eyes wide with a fear so profound it was almost innocence. And in that face, a ghost stirred. It was a memory so old the edges had frayed, of another young man with the same hopeful glint, the same proud stance, apprentice. His son, in all but blood, the boy who had listened to his teachings with rapt attention, whose laughter had once filled these silent woods, and whose life had been stolen by a fever no poultice or prayer could cure. The memory was a shard of ice in the druid's frozen heart, a sudden, painful thaw in a landscape of perpetual winter. The bear's massive head tilted. The killing fury that had guided him for centuries wavered, disarmed by a phantom. This boy was not his lost student, but the resemblance was a cruel, beautiful trick of fate. To spill this one's blood would be to desecrate that sacred memory a second time. The beast let out another soft rumble, then slowly, deliberately, turned its head away from Liam. It took a heavy step backward, then another, its immense form melting back into the deep shadows of the ferns. It paused once, a dark silhouette against the trees, and emitted a short, gruff sound. Not a threat, but a command to follow. The sentence of death had been commuted, spared by a ghost. Numb and obedient, Liam followed the retreating form of the bear, his mind a storm of terror and confusion. The beast led him to a place where the roots of a great oak twisted into the shape of a doorway, leading into an earthen barrow fused with living stone. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and old magic. The bear seemed to dissolve into the shadows, and from them emerged the wizened form of the druid Kalen. His movements were slow, as if he were remembering how to wear his own skin. Without a word, the old man gestured for Liam to sit. He then began to speak, his voice a dry rustle like dead leaves scraping across stone. He spoke of the forest's deep, old life, of a time when the boundaries between man and beast were thin as mist. He told of the art of shape-shifting, of the raw power that flowed through the land, waiting to be harnessed. He described the feeling of bones reshaping, of muscles knitting into new forms, of running as a wolf under a silver moon and soaring as an eagle on a thermal wind. Liam listened, his fear slowly being replaced by a macabre, hypnotic fascination. The horrors of the day, the blood, the screams. The visceral finality of his friends' deaths began to feel distant, replaced by the impossible reality of the druid's words. His mind, struggling to reconcile the mundane world he knew with the one being unveiled, sought refuge in disbelief. It was all too fantastical, too terrible to be real. A hysterical laugh bubbled in his chest, a desperate release of tension. "It sounds incredible," he stammered, the words feeling foolish and inadequate the moment they left his lips. He meant it as a jest, a nervous deflection from the terrifying truth he was being shown. He waved a dismissive hand, the gesture of a boy trying to shrug off a nightmare. "I wish I could do such a thing." The words hung in the air, a casual, careless invocation. In the dim light, he did not see the cruel, calculating smile that slowly stretched across Kalen's ancient face. The druid had been waiting for a key to turn, and the boy, in his ignorance, had just provided it. The air in the barrow grew heavy, charged with a static energy that made the hairs on Liam's arms stand on end. Kalen's smile was a sickled moon of promised pain. He repeated Liam's own words back to him, not as a question, but as a verdict. Wish can be granted. Not all power demands a price. Still trapped in the dizzying unreality of the moment, Liam gave a nervous, dismissive wave. The jest was his last tether to the world he knew. A price? I'd pay it. The declaration, born of fear and foolishness, was his undoing. In an instant, the druid's withered hand shot out, gripping Liam's forearm with the strength of stone roots. Agony, white-hot and absolute, exploded from the point of contact. It was not a simple pain, but a violation, a force tearing him apart from the inside. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as the bones in his arms splintered and lengthened. His spine arched violently, vertebrae grinding and reshaping with a sound like grinding gravel. A coarse, gray pelt tore through his skin, not growing, but erupting, each follicle a needle of fire. His jaw unhinged with a wet pop, his teeth elongating into yellowed fangs that sliced through his own gums, filling his mouth with the taste of copper. His screams became choked, guttural roars as his humanity was systematically dismantled. He fell to the ground, his body a convulsing canvas of torment, as muscle and sinew writhed into a new monstrous form. Through the red haze of suffering, a new sensation bloomed, not pain, but power. A raw, dominant energy flooded his being, and from his transforming throat erupted a sound that was neither fully human nor fully wolf. It was a howl, long and piercing, that tore through the ancient forest. It was a sound of birth and damnation, a declaration of sovereignty that silenced the night and sent a primal shiver of obedience through every wolf pack for miles around. This was not the cry of a simple beast. It was the first howl of an alpha. The agony receded like a tide, leaving in its wake a new and terrifying landscape of sensation. Liam stood, but he was no longer Liam. He was a creature of myth, towering on two powerful legs, a monstrous hybrid of man and wolf. His body was a tapestry of corded muscle and coarse, silver-flecked fur. His hands were now cruel talons, twitching with latent power, and his muzzle was still wet with the blood from his own ruptured gums. He raised these new hands before his face, turning them over in the dim light. The memory of the pain was already fading, overshadowed by the raw, intoxicating energy coursing through his veins. He felt the solid strength in his limbs, the sharp clarity of 1,000 new scents flooding his mind, the damp earth, the fierce sweat of small creatures hiding in their burrows, the distant, tantalizing musk of deer. He flexed his claws, and the air whistled as it parted. But the most profound change was not in his body, but in his mind. It was as if a radio tuned to a single station had suddenly opened to a chorus of voices. Faint, instinctual presences brushed against his consciousness, the wolf packs that roamed his new domain. He could feel their simple hungers, their loyalties, their hierarchies. And he knew, with a primal certainty that brooked no argument, that they were his to command. A low, pleased rumble started deep in his chest. The fear, the helplessness, the insignificance he had felt mere moments ago were gone. He was no longer the prey, the frightened boy in the clearing. He was power incarnate. He was a king, and the entire wild world was his throne. The intoxicating rush of power was cut short by the dry, rasping voice of the druid. Kalen watched the monstrous form of the young man with the detached interest of a sculptor assessing a finished piece. "You believe the price was the pain?" he stated, his words slashing through the Alpha's burgeoning euphoria like a shard of ice. That was merely the opening of the gate. He began to outline the true nature of the curse, his voice weaving a tapestry of damnation. He spoke of the full moon, not as a celestial body, but as a merciless warden that would seize control of his flesh, forcing the change upon him in an endless cycle of agony. But worse than the pain was the erosion. With every transformation, a piece of his human soul would flake away memories of his family, his name, his past. The compassion, the reason, the very essence of Liam would be worn down until nothing remained but the base instincts of the wolf. The horror of this fate crashed down upon the Alpha, colder and more suffocating than any physical pain. The majestic form that had moments before felt like a crown now felt like a cage, its bars closing in with each beat of his powerful heart. The intoxicating connection to the wolf packs now seemed like a prelude to being consumed by them, his identity dissolving into their collective primal mind. The power had a cost far greater than he could have ever conceived in his naive jest, a price that was his very self. A raw, guttural roar of denial tore from the Alpha's throat, a sound so full of rage and betrayal that it shook the very roots of the barrow. "Undo it," he snarled, his voice a horrific blend of human desperation and bestial fury. He took a threatening step forward, his massive, clawed hand slashing through the air toward the ancient druid. "Take it back," but Kalen did not flinch. He simply stood, a monument of weathered flesh and bone, his ancient eyes reflecting no fear, only a profound and weary finality. He shook his head slowly, a gesture that carried the weight of centuries. "The magic is woven into the fabric of your soul. It is a part of you now. It's too late." The finality of those words ignited a firestorm within the Alpha. All the terror, the confusion, and the horrifying glimpse of his future condensed into a single, murderous impulse. He lunged, his powerful body uncoiling with the intent to tear the old man limb from limb, to force him to recant his curse with blood and pain. Yet as his claws swept through the space where Kalen stood, they closed on nothing but empty air. The druid's form dissolved into a swirl of dead leaves and a cold, misty vapor. The last thing the Alpha saw was those impassive eyes, watching him from the dissipating cloud before they too vanished into nothingness. The druid was gone, leaving the first werewolf utterly alone in the silent, dark barrow, enraged, terrified, and cursed beyond all hope of reprieve. The bargain had been struck, the price set, and there was no one left to plead with but the uncaring moon. Years bled into one another, marked only by the relentless cycle of the moon. The young man named Liam was a ghost, a faded portrait locked in the attic of the beast's mind. The Alpha now ruled the forest, a silver-maned terror whose howl commanded the night. The futile search for the druid had long been abandoned, replaced by a new, all-consuming passion, the hunt. He no longer sought the druid. He had become the very instrument of the forest's wrath that Kalen had once been. But his vengeance was not for the sanctity of the woods. It was a personal, bitter crusade against his own past. The scent of hunters, the stink of their iron. The arrogance of their sweat became a trigger for a rage that burned hotter than any memory. He discovered a terrible, selfish secret. The curse was a fire consuming his humanity, but when he bit another, When he forced his affliction upon a human, the transformation stole a little less of himself. It was not a cure, but a postponement, a way to feed his own existence by damning others. He became a poison, spreading his torment to buy more time. He built a pack. He was their alpha, their creator, and their jailer. They were his bulwark against the final transformation, his living shields. Under the full moon, he would lead them, a storm of fang and claw descending upon any hunting party foolish enough to enter their domain. The forest floor, once stained with the blood of his friends, was now perpetually rich with the blood of those who shared their profession. The hunter had become the hunter, and his new prey was his own reflection. The pack grew in number but withered in spirit. Alpha's leadership was not one of kinship, but of cold, brutal utility. He positioned the newer, weaker members as pawns in the hunt, using them to draw the hunter's arrows while he struck from the shadows. The spoils of the kill were always his by right, the choicest meat consumed to feed his strength while others gnawed on bone. Whispers began to circulate on the wind, carried from one disgruntled wolf to another. They spoke of the Alpha's distant gaze, a look not of a leader protecting his own, but of a creature desperately clinging to something they could not see. The festering wound in the pack had a source, a lean black-furred wolf named Fenlin. He had been a woodcutter, a gentleman turned into a monster mere months ago. The change had not hardened him, it magnified his cowardice and sharpened his cunning. He was the most recent sacrifice to the Alpha's hunger for time, and he felt the injustice like a fresh brand. While the older wolves had grown numb to their servitude, Fenlin's resentment was still raw and potent. He began his work not with a snarl, but with a whisper. He would sidle up to a grizzled veteran after a hunt, noting how the Alpha had hung back while others bled. He would whimper softly with the younger ones, suggesting that a true leader fights alongside his pack, not above it. He spoke of the curse not as a shared burden, but as a theft. The Alpha had not saved them from a lonely fate. He had condemned them to prolong his own. The poison of these truths seeped into the pack's heart. Loyalty, once given freely to their creator, began to curdle into a quiet, seething hatred. The hunt was no longer their sole focus. A new, more dangerous prey was being chosen. The festering resentment within the pack found its voice in the dead of night. When the moon was a sliver and the Alpha's command felt most distant, Fenlin, the black-furred wolf, was no longer just murmuring discontent. He was building an alliance, a conspiracy woven from shared bitterness and the promise of survival. He moved among the others like a shadow, his words a subtle poison that eroded the last vestiges of their loyalty. He sought out the brutes who craved power, whispering that the strength of the Alpha could be theirs. He found the fearful hissing that their only path to safety was to remove the tyrant who saw them as fodder. To the newest turned, whose human memories were still vivid, he painted a picture of a different pack, one led not by a selfish monster, but by a cunning survivor who understood the value of every member. He did not speak of a battle he could win alone, but of a rebellion they could win together. The Alpha, bloated with his own power, and the stolen time of his followers, remained arrogantly oblivious. He saw the sidelong glances and caught the scent of fear. But he mistook it for the natural order, for the deference he was owed. He did not see the secret gatherings in the ravines, the coordinated hunting practices that were really drills for combat, or the way the pack now watched him not with obedience, but with the cold, assessing eyes of a jury. Fenlin's whisper had become a collective, silent verdict. The stage was set, and the players were in position, waiting only for the signal to turn their fangs against the one who had created them. The challenge came not with a howl, but with a snarl of pure hatred as Fenlin lunged from the ranks during the pack's evening gathering. The Alpha reacted with thunderous fury, swatting the black wolf aside with a blow that cracked ribs and painted the ferns with a spray of blood. But as Fenlin scrambled back, yelping in pain, the trap was sprung. The entire pack, moving as one, turned on their leader. The clearing erupted into a maelstrom of fangs and fury. It was not a duel, but a slaughter. The Alpha was a whirlwind of destruction, his immense strength shattering bones and rending flesh. He disemboweled a young wolf with a casual swipe, his jaws crushing the skull of another who dared to leap at his throat. The air grew thick with the coppery stench of blood and the cacophony of snarls and dying whimpers. The forest floor became a grisly tapestry of fallen pack members, their loyalty paid in full. Yet for every one he killed, two more took their place, their teeth sinking into his legs, his back, his haunches. They fought with the desperate courage of the condemned, knowing there was no retreat. The Alpha's strength, vast as it was, began to wane under the relentless coordinated assault. He was being drowned in a tide of his own creation. Fenlon, bleeding and limping, saw his moment. As the Alpha staggered under the weight of three wolves latched onto his shoulders, the Black Wolf launched his final, desperate attack. He surged forward and sank his fangs deep into the Alpha's exposed throat. It was not a clean kill, but a savage, tearing grip. The Alpha thrashed, his powerful claws raking Fenlon's flank, but the Black Wolf held on, his jaw locked in a death grip. With a final, wet, tearing sound, the Alpha's great body shuddered and collapsed. His silver mane matted with the blood of his pack and his own. The howling rebellion had ended. The tyrant was fallen. Life bled from the Alpha in slow, ragged pulses, each one painting the earth beneath him a darker crimson. The victorious pack, their numbers halved and their bodies torn, had already turned their allegiance. A low, unified howl rose into the night, not of mourning, but of fealty to Fenlon, who stood panting and bleeding over the fallen tyrant. The new Alpha had been crowned. As the world narrowed to a pinprick of fading light, a shadow fell over him. It did not move like a wolf, nor did it cast a shape upon the ground. It was simply a concentration of darkness, a void that drank the moonlight. From it emerged the wizened form of Kalen. The druid looked down upon his creation, his ancient face devoid of triumph or pity, only the calm of a concluded experiment. He knelt, his voice a whisper that cut through the death rattle in the Alpha's throat. The rage you thought was the curse. It's the fury that made you a monster. That was always yours, Kalen murmured. The true price of the curse was the betrayal of your friends.